I'm Deb Guenther. I'm a Landscape Architecture Foundation board member and a partner at Methuen. It's really a privilege and an honor to be doing this work with this panel. It's really a very engaged, very energetic panel, and I want to thank them for all the work they've done. It's I think, going to be a really great conversation, and we're looking forward to. They were willing to tackle some tough issues, and so we want to invite you as well to really engage in the dialogue as we're going forward on this topic, because it's a tough one, and but it's obviously a very important one, as we heard from the declarations yesterday. So our panelists today: Ann Whiston Spirn, Diane Jones-Allen, Jeff Howe, and Alison Hirsch are with us. And Kurt Culbertson, unfortunately, was a really involved member of our conversations, but he was not going to be able to be here today. He had a medical emergency, but he's fine, but he just can't travel for another week or so. So we're sorry to miss him. He really contributed a lot, and you'll recognize some of his provocative questions and kind of has integrated itself into the conversation. So to share a little bit about our process, we have had some great conversations. Gina Ford's declaration, Into an Era of Landscape Humanism, really launched us. That was something that really resonated with us when we had our conversations. Got us talking about diversity as a matter of survival for the profession, how we stay relevant in an era of population shifts, demographic shifts. We talked about alternative modes of practice, how time is a requirement that we don't always have on projects in building trust with communities, but it's a really critical piece. With the need to become policy builders, the need to challenge the diminishment of public space, and our rapid change, which we heard a lot about yesterday from many of the declarations in culture, from globalization and mass migration, or to quote Christophe Giraud, where each landscape will thus become an invitation to express a culture of difference in an act of superb creative defiance. We took that, you could tell even beyond those topics, we had a lot of conversations. We took those wide-ranging discussions and zoomed into 3 points. Acknowledge and inspire diversity. Be proactive by making design and equity opportunities happen. And radicalize, and be willing to, as Kurt Culbertson put it, kind of get into the mud of politics. So the first point is to acknowledge and inspire. We want to acknowledge that the last 3 years of Olmsted Scholars, the Olmsted Scholar Award winners, included women of color, and actually I know a couple folks are here that I'm going to mention their name. If you would stand up, it would be great. We want to acknowledge you and as a future leader and already leading in the profession. Azura Cox, I think, is here, and Sarah Zudi, and Maria Munoz. So if they would stand for a moment and acknowledge them. So some of you may have seen Lemonade. How many people have seen the Beyonce? Yeah. And I think it's really, if you're not sure that you want to see it, I encourage you to see it. Watching it, if you just want to see beautiful landscapes and how she uses them so powerfully. But the reason we're showing it is Lemonade has really centered Black women's voices in the mainstream at a scale that is changing the national conversation. It's controversial, and that's important. We want to have that provocation in these conversations. And it's a national conversation about whose voices are heard and whose voices are we comfortable hearing from. So the first question, I want to start with Diane. Why is this we all know that diversity is, I think we'd all accept that diversity is an important way that we do our work and that those voices are important. But why now? Why do we need to really raise this up as an intentional issue in our work?
Okay, so through the declarations, it was very clear that to address the social, cultural, the aesthetic, and the ecological challenges that we face, you need diverse minds, a diverse population, a diverse set of landscape architects. Everybody can agree on that, and that was pretty clear to me. So to me, the question is really, so how do we achieve that? And I think first and foremost, we have to recognize the diversity that we already have within landscape architecture. There was a diversity summit, and one of the things that came out of it was that the millennials, the young landscape architects, want role models. Well, there are role models. Deb and I went back and forth. I'm all for the beehive, but I actually wanted the images of those 3 women of color that won the Olmsted Awards in the past consecutive years up there. Thank you. And also, to make my point, when I looked at the survey, you know, it said whites and Caucasians, I think Latinos, and then others. African Americans were like left out. And my point is that we should have, landscape architecture takes all international people, it takes people of very different colors, ages, races. We should be more acknowledging that they're there. So I'm just going to use African Americans as an example. And my example is that there was an African American landscape architect who was president of ASLA. There's an African American landscape architect who won a presidential medal, Everett Fly, this year for his work in historic preservation. There's an thank you. There's an African American landscape architect who is, his name is Kuzlin Taylor. He's a landscape architect. He is working in the neighborhood where Freddie Gray died using landscape architecture to heal that community. There's a landscape architect that's doing coastal restoration and disaster recovery in both New Orleans and in Haiti. We are there. We are landscape architects. And if we're going to have role models address this, grow, it's like we're kind of afraid that we're there. I mean, I actually got many calls from African American landscape architects when they looked at the panels, and they said there's no reflection. And the last thing I'll say is, the importance is that yesterday in slides, I saw many pictures of African Americans. There was Tim Dugan, had a lovely picture of a little boy in the lower 9, very, happy. He could be a landscape architect one day, but will he? Unless he knows that Kofi Boone exists, Doug Williams exists, Everett Fly exists, Perry Howard exists, Kuzlin Taylor exists, and I could go on and on. Karen Phillips, Elizabeth Kennedy, they are there. And if we truly, truly want diversity, and I want to, give kudos for Gina for putting those statistics up there, we need more than statistics. It shouldn't be all talk, If we really want diversity, we need to recognize it. We need to praise it. We need to, lift it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that really speaks to the intentionality that this panel has really talked quite a lot about, is how do we make those intentional gestures or intentional actions. I think the follow-up, Jeff, did you want to follow up on that diversity question?
Sure. I think the question was, why diversity is important. And my answer to that is that justice is important. Equity is important, and it's the right thing to do. And so as simple as that. But I think I want to go further than that in saying, especially in light of kind of what we learned yesterday, all the grand challenges that we're facing in the next 50 years, sea level rise, acute flood events, storm surge, migration, urbanization, all that. One thing we haven't talked enough about is that these phenomena are happening in different contexts, okay, impacting different people. Technical solutions are important, but for us to really be able to address those issues with full knowledge of its complexity, and to have the capacity to understand those issues, we need to diverse our ranks. Okay? We need to bring more people into our profession. We need to diversify our thinking. Okay? We need to understand kind of the political and cultural nuances of how solutions are applied to different contexts. And if we don't do that, I argue that this profession will become a form of colonialism. Okay? A colonial practice that imposed order and structure and norms on others, okay? Especially vulnerable population, and a form of kind of colonialization that assumes universal solutions, okay, and trying to impose those on others. And so I think we need to be critical. And then I think diversity is a tremendously important lens for us to see as a profession.
Great, thank you. Sure, go ahead.
And we can do it. We can do it. When I entered this profession in 1970, in 1969, I graduated from college in art history from Harvard. And before the spring of 1969, I'd never heard of landscape architecture. One of my classmates at Harvard said she was going to Berkeley in landscape architecture. I thought, from Harvard to gardening? It wasn't until the spring of 1969, my senior year, that I saw Ian McHarg's film on public television, Multiply and Subdue the Earth. And I said, wow, that's landscape architecture? Whoa. And I got to the University of Pennsylvania on a PhD fellowship in art history and found that Ian McHarg was right here. And I went to the bookstore and got Design with Nature. And the next year I transferred into landscape architecture. And my story is just one story. In 1970, this profession didn't look anything like it does today. There were very few women. There were very few students with liberal arts degrees. Very, very few, mainly B.Arcs and BLAs. And McHarg told us at the end of our second year in the landscape architecture MLA program at Penn that our class had made him decide to keep offering the MLA degree, to keep admitting three-year students. That it had been in the balance, and I heard also from colleagues later at Harvard that it had been at that point in late 60s, early 70s, in the balance about whether it was possible to take liberal arts students and to educate them in landscape architecture in a three-year program. Now, look at our profession today. How many women there are. Vast numbers. Look at what liberal arts folks, the B.Arcs, and that's not to disparage the B.Arcs and the BLAs, who have tremendous understanding and background that they bring to graduate degrees or to the profession at large. But I believe that this influx of all of these liberal arts background folks really helped transform the profession from 1970 to what it is today. And I think to me, it's an example of how diversifying our ranks can really enrich the profession greatly. But it means that we have to be speaking to the public. Where is the Multiply and Subdue the Earth of today on public television? I wrote The Granite Garden for a public audience in order to reach that. And I would say one of the most gratifying things that people have said to me is, I'm in landscape architecture because I read The Granite Garden and found out what landscape architecture was about. And Kate Orff is in the schools, that science kit for Staten Island. We need to be out there, not just talking to each other about how important our profession is, but celebrating our profession and writing and making films and videos and curriculum for middle school and high school students and for the public at large. And we can greatly diversify this profession within a decade or two.
Great. So our second point that we want to talk about is being provocative and really talking about making design and equity opportunities happen because they don't always fit within our traditional practice modes. So we had a lot of conversation about this, that traditional work processes can really be supported by these alternative modes of practice. So Ai Weiwei is looking over us here as one of the artists that has bridged that ability to bring attention to not only a terrific design experience, but also attention to the processes and the attention to the collaboration and the very intentional part of what he's communicating is about how who's involved and whose voices are showing up in his art. So I wanted to take it back to Anne with her long-term work, your long-term work with West Philadelphia. You've really been a pioneer for us in the profession in navigating how to make these equity issues become present in our work. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we might see over the next few years those traditional practices supporting racial and cultural diversity and in our work.
Well, after The Granite Garden was published in 1984, I decided to devote a lot of my work to looking at how to bring together restoring the natural environment with the urban natural environment, with rebuilding inner city communities, and also how to do so in ways that beautified the communities as well as made them more healthier and safer and more just. I would say the first thing is, given the sea of, not too many, I went into African-American neighborhoods, first in Boston, but my long-standing 30-year action research project here in Philadelphia is virtually 100% African-American community, only 5 minutes away here from campus where we're sitting. And it became very clear to me that it took a long-term commitment to build trust in the community. And I originally only planned to stay there for the terms of the grant that I had that was paying for the work. It was for 3 years that turned into 4. But I realized after 4 years that I built all these relationships and that it made so many other things possible for me to investigate that wouldn't have been possible before. And this was a community that didn't know they needed a landscape architect. There was no money to hire a landscape architect, so we were there basically with foundation money on a grant that was action research on a greening project. And I was interested in these issues of vacant lands and how vacant lands really offered an enormous opportunity to reshape the city in concert with natural processes and rebuild the city. But there was no one out there at that time paying attention to this, and no one out there coming up with money for it. So so I saw green infrastructure as a way, and the issue of CSOs, combined sewer overflows, as a way to bring these together. So I think that what I view my own role as an academic practitioner is to open up territory to demonstrate the efficacy and importance of landscape architecture thinking and what landscape architects have to contribute to places where people don't think of landscape architects as having a role. And I'm really gratified to see 20, 30 years later now that CSOs and vacant land, using stormwater on vacant land to both simultaneously rebuild the neighborhood and reduce and improve regional water quality is now something that landscape architecture firms are getting paid to do. So I think I would urge my, to your question to finish up, is that I think academic practitioners have a responsibility to make our research useful to practice. And one way we can do that is to investigate areas that are currently not recognized as domains for the practice. But I was really impressed by Kate. I think Kate Orff does this really well, in that she does have she's subsidized by an academic appointment as well as having the office. and Tim Dugan, which was a really wonderful work that he described, where there he is in practice. You know, he's not an academic practitioner. He's there in practice, and he talked about how to make opportunities by not just responding, being reactive, but being proactive. Not just waiting for the RFP to come out to respond to, but going out and making opportunities happen by finding the funding streams and helping clients put those funding streams together in order to do the project that you want to do.
And Jeff, could you follow up a little bit on the ecology of practice between private, all of you are academics, but also have your private, also your own practices, and so maybe, and you have a book that just came out now, Urbanism, that kind of works on, proposes some of that?
First, actually, Anne's work has been an inspiration to me. Unfortunately, when I was a student here, Anne was working on her book, so I didn't get a chance to work on it. It was Philadelphia project. That would have been great. But when I moved to Seattle, I kind of started a project of my own, working with the international district communities, predominantly Asian American, immigrant, elderly community, very low income. And the community is also bisected by a freeway, the same freeway that went under Freeway Park. Okay, except that we don't have the benefit of a freeway park to bridge the community. So this is, all the narrative that we need to know about all these kind of great projects. Anyway, in a similar kind of manner as what Anne has done here, we work with nonprofit organization, community-based organization, different actors. We often start with very zero to very little funding. By just talking with community, leveraging opportunities, we finally got something started. And a community center was started about 7 years ago. We leveraged about $3 million in our first 5 years to support different kinds of projects, including a project that Kong Jian-Yu is working on now, his first West Coast project now in Seattle. And so that's, that enterprise, the ecology of practice that I talked about before. And so it's about kind of interdependence that Randy referred to yesterday, okay? Interdependence among different actors in the community, in the profession. And so I think that's critically important. One thing I want to kind of touch on also, I think is relevant to our discussion today, and I think was missing yesterday in terms of the context of the 1966 Declaration, is that around the time, so 1960s, there was another movement going on, a movement to democratize planning and design, okay? And so Paul Davidoff, okay, also a Penn graduate in city and regional planning. And in 1965, he came out with an article called Advocacy and Pluralism in Planning, okay? Arguing that we should be, planning is not a rational, should not be a rational top-down kind of practice, okay? We should give voice to people, okay? We should be recognizing, multiple voices. We should be supporting and advocating for those who are not at the table, okay? And, but somehow we didn't see that in the Declaration from 1966, which I thought was very unfortunate. But it was great yesterday, again, hearing from Kate Wolf, emerging folks who are talking about activism and political engagement again. So that's really encouraging, and I think the profession missed the opportunity 50 years ago, and let's not miss that again this time around.
So Alison, I want to go to you on what we've been working on a lot of these issues for a long time, and what are the things, what's our obstacle? What's our hang up? What's holding us back?
Yeah, well, before I move on to that, I just wanted to respond to Jeff a little bit, because as a historian, I also enjoy contextualization and situating ideas, and I also am an ABBA fan, so I was thrilled by that point of reference. But I agree. There was in 1966 a period of great social tumult, but outside the environmental movement, there was outside of these few unique practices, Paul Davidoff, Larry Halperin, Carl Lynn, who I'll talk about in a minute. But there was a general social complacency despite extremes in social activism in the arts, politics, and society at the time. And you had the 1963 Great March on Washington, 1964 Free Speech Movement, 1964 there was actually one of the first 1960s race riots here in North Philadelphia, 1965 the Watts Rebellion, and that was a real sort of expression of rage against injustices, including spatial and environmental injustice. And landscape architects at the time tended to stay within the burgeoning suburbs where the commissions were, but those exceptions are important to revisit. I mean, Grady Clay, in terms of his editorial work, Carl Lynn worked with North Philadelphia communities of color and actually activated ASLA to respond to the 1967 Kerner Commission report, which identified the causes of the race riots. So it's important to readdress these practices, but also recognize that Gina Ford brought up a number of practices today that are really meaningful exceptions to what I'm seeing in terms of the declarations and overall practices, a sort of continued tendency of the profession to avoid issues of inclusiveness. And those practices don't necessarily sacrifice the qualitative project, which is something that was discussed earlier in the aesthetics panel. And they certainly don't leave these efforts to those few community-oriented design practices, but actually integrating the social component becomes integral to the way we practice today. And just this, I'm looking at this visual prompt, and I appreciate it. Ai Weiwei's piece is certainly bringing up questions of sort of the geopolitics of economic and cultural exchange, and a number of the declarations yesterday addressed issues of resisting cultural homogenization unfolding through, or potentially through, the forces of globalization. And clearly, this emphasis isn't new. I mean, Kenneth Frampton was writing about architectures of resistance in the early 1980s. But you had actually read a part of Christoph's declaration that I brought up in one of our conversations, and he says, as cultures disappear, other hybrids will arise, underlining the prevalence of local lore over globalization, and each landscape will thus become an invitation to express a culture of difference in an act of superb creative defiance. And so, whereas yesterday there were a number of people advocating for cultural landscape preservation and safeguarding cultural heritage, Patricia O'Donnell, Feng Han, Charles Birnbaum. One way to sort of interpret and expand on that statement is also to recognize that place and cultural identity are not necessarily are no longer really so intimately bound, but are increasingly contested in a world of mass migrations of people. So it challenges and complexifies the ecumen that Christoph was talking about yesterday. So part of recognizing the localization of the global is bringing forth these sort of new hybrid acts of occupation and expression in public space through meaningful localized intervention. And that might be one means of sort of mitigating this idea of the potentials of cultural colonialism. And that's related to issues of aesthetics. I mean, you can probably identify that I have, there's a lot of ambiguities in the way I think about aesthetics and being someone who is interested in issues of equity and inclusion.
Great, thank you. So our third point was to really embrace this idea of radicalization, radicalizing our profession, getting more involved in taking a position, which is really the definition of radical, like pushing people, moving people toward taking a position. So Ramiro Gomez is a painter that makes it crystal clear that we're all connected. And in order to have these discussions more easily, we want to have a language to make the dialogue as clear as this picture is. And that a lot of our conversation revolved around the fact that we are interdependent now in these future generations. It's going to be a requirement to be interdependent. So how do we help that happen in academia? What are some of the things that can help us be more effective negotiators? Diane, would you like to start?
Well, one thing is to actually, get, and there's, controversy, or departments have to be careful about this, as you know, is to get students into the community. you know. And of course, there's students, and you know, and they're learning, but it's really important because it's important for you know, communities to see what, you know, landscape architects can do, and it's also important for students to understand the diversity of communities and the diversity of issues. So in you know, community service, that's, you know, there's argument about, you know, what that should be, and you know, how you handle that because of the fact that students are only in classes for a semester, and these problems take years, as you know. So, you know, that all has to be handled. We can't say that now, but just to say that that's part of learning, is to get students on the ground and to get them to see, you know, these issues and to interact with people that are like and different than them.
Great. Anyone else want to follow up? We want to take one more minute before we go to our polling question that we have.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, the simplest thing to do is basically to kind of get out of the comfort zone of studios and, you know, school, you know, Photoshop and laptop, and to be kind of in the community, on the site, in the face of real people and real issues. And then I think from yesterday we actually learned that, you know, schools are doing more of that now. But I think I'm not quite sure if the level of engagement is actually substantive enough. Okay, so if we go out, we bring students out to a community, but our methods and pedagogy, you know, don't change, right? It's actually, I mean, going back to this notion of cultural colonialism, we're doing that again. Doesn't matter how, you know, where the people are, and so we need to be kind of self-critical about kind of what we do, and not just kind of in the different contexts in which we operate.
That's great. That's a great segue. Yeah.
Follow up on that. I think one thing that I've learned over the last 30 plus years of action research is the importance of and I think Kate Orff mentioned this yesterday, the importance of always doing a physical program and a social program together, so that every social program should have a physical manifestation that can serve as the symbol and inspire and attract, we were talking about design and aesthetics before, attract devotion and love and identity and all of those things that a really well-designed physical manifestation can do. But that it should also be linked up to a social program that somehow connects to the community or the society within which it resides, and that it's part of a larger program. I think that to tie back around to this larger global issues and local issues of climate change, I would recommend that everybody in this room read The Force Majeure by Newton and Helen Harrison as soon as it comes out. It's due out in the next month or so. It's a retrospective of their work, the artists who are now in their 80s. They were in the group around Smithson and Sundqvist, et cetera. They discovered climate change in 1972 and devoted the rest of their career to bringing what they call bringing forth a new state of mind. And so I would, in terms of radicalizing things, I would challenge everybody in their work to take this notion of the Harrisons, of that our task is to bring forth a new state of mind through our work. Because as they say, the problems have been caused by old ways of thinking. And we need a new state of mind in order to rise to these challenges. So in this case, these are artists that some of their work is almost indistinguishable from what landscape architects do. So I really recommend you look at it in terms of radicalizing your practice.
Thank you. So we have a polling question for you. This is going to be frustrating because you're going to want to say, I want to do all these, or these all apply. But what we're asking is for you to pick the phrase that means the most to you in terms of your definition of social equity. So which express that the most strongly to you? So in our policy conversations and kind of political conversations yesterday, it doesn't look like proposing a vision is driving, it's more of a personal one-on-one response. Any comments from, we have just a couple minutes, so we're going to go to the Q&A, but any comments about this poll?
Well, in terms of co-design, one thing, and if you talk about academia, one thing that really helps is if more of the professors, the academics, looked like the community, and which would attract more students that look like the community, so that you kind of, look like the communities. So that's one thing that we have to work on in academia.
I'd like to speak to the second. I think the thing that I've learned over time is that I've moved from advocacy to capacity building. I still advocate, but in working with communities, I found that that really, if you're going to design in a way that makes for socially just, and if we would talk about what is social equity in terms of design, I think part of it is empowering and leaving the neighborhood not only with a better plan or a better design than existed before, but with the knowledge, with more knowledge. And in that sense, capacity building to move on and continue. And also to say that this is a way to transform practice, because through capacity building with a community, you learn, and so it becomes a co-learning process, and it transforms your own practice. So if you think of things as co-production, and that you're learning as much as the people you're working with, and you're co-producing this. It doesn't mean giving up the designer's role. It does not mean giving up your professional role, and to my mind.
Well, in terms of how to radicalize the profession and how that's instigated in academia, I mean, I think, well, I'm no longer seeing the poll, but how to integrate diverse participatory methods to enrich our creative practices both speaks to the first and the second aspects of both capacity building and co-production. And we keep identifying Kate Orff, but she was one of the few people that actually talked about design methods as it relates to equity and access. And so, her introduction of these new tools of engagement I thought were really interesting. The roadway sit-ins, the park raisings, these ways of integrating neighbors or diverse constituents into the creative process, enforces them to sort of negotiate and confront difference rather than remain isolated from one another. So I thought that was actually a really powerful way of instigating a project.
I also advocate for the second option. I think if we think about kind of what we're trying to do is about changing the politics, we need to build capacity for the local people. So co-design, participatory design is a step, but the outcome should be looking at capacity.
Great. Okay, we have a few questions, about 5 minutes to talk about these questions. And any that pop out to you that you'd like to respond to? I mean, here, the top one, of course, is one that folks are working on quite a lot, and to, I think, was a big part of our conversation. How do we encourage individuals from communities of color or less privileged upbringing, class differences? How do we attract that into the profession?
Well, we go into schools. We heard of an example of that yesterday. I worked on an urban watershed curriculum with a middle school here in West Philadelphia for 6 years, and those kids learned about what landscape architecture is. Perry Howard decided to leave private practice and go to take on the chairmanship of North Carolina AT, a historically black college, in order to bring in more young black students into the profession. Randy Hester took the leadership at Berkeley of being in conversation with Perry and bringing people like Walter Hood on to get master's degrees. So I think that there's a role, and there are many different kinds of roles that one can have. But also this notion of capacity building in the communities you work in, that if you do that, and then there'll be some people that might think, maybe landscape architecture is for me. As opposed to just coming and doing something and your working methods are opaque, and your ways of thinking are opaque. But if you make them more transparent, and again, I must say that's not giving up your professional expertise, but just to welcome people into your thinking process.
And Diane, could you go to your original comment when we started talking on the panel about diversity within the profession is really a matter of our survival as a profession? Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I said, to myself, and someone last night, I was saying, if we don't diversify, we'll end up like the Republican Party and we'll implode. But, so, it's just really important. I actually wanted to answer the one that has 29 up there. So I beg to differ in that I do think that minorities and women are leading, are staying, and are getting jobs. It's just that they're not put up front. The Landscape Architecture Specifier News actually had an article which had several African American landscape architects that are working in private practice. Brad McGee, who I want to give shout outs to, has in 2015, like consecutively, he had an article with Kofi Boone, he had an article, with other minority landscape architects doing, So it's about, yes, I'm not saying that all is well and wonderful, don't get me wrong. And we have a lot of work to do because, yes, we need to get more of us in school, we need to make more of us professors, we need to have more of us owning practices, but we are out there. And of course there's Walter Hood, we have, we're out there doing things. And it's just a matter of, having, when the ASLA, LAF, the organizations that we have, helping to expose those of us that are out there working, so that we can increase, us in our capacity to deal with these problems, these diversity issues.
And I did a little bit of number crunching, and 50 years from now, or if we were reflected the current census of racial diversity, only about really half the room would be white. So it's significant now, but it's also 50 years from now will be even more significant about who's in the room, when we have this conversation again.
Well, we just have to invite us to the room, and that's the problem. A lot of us were not invited to the room. Okay.
So we have 1 more minute. Anyone want to take on?
I might take on the public space
Yeah,
question.
I want to.
Okay, then I'll be brief. But when Deb originally talked about introducing the lemonade slide, she talked about how Beyonce uses lyrics and imagery to provoke discomfort in order to stimulate conversation. And a few of the declarations talked about being confrontational, about moving beyond the status quo. Randy's in particular, another actually stated landscape architecture should help to prevent tensions and confrontation. Thus, landscape architecture contributes to peace, conflict prevention, and reconciliation. And I brought this up in our conversations, but and I'm taking this a little bit out of context, the statement, but I fear it could be misinterpreted because while we might strive to heal communities and provide platforms to talk about peace, I would argue that we do have the responsibility to protect the public realm through physical manifestations of public space where conflict, confrontation, debate, exchange are encouraged and promoted, and where even discomfort is promoted through exposure to otherness. So rather than create more spaces that are privatized, surveilled, regulated, and controlled to exclude and enforce conformity. So I think, yes, public space is still relevant.
So you can, great. So you can see here our call to actions. One that's not on the list that I'm going to highlight is just that because of this terrific conversation we've been having, the time that we are evolving the declaration through LAF between now and the ASLA conference in October, we're going to really do intentional outreach around that task force and ensure that we have a really good diversity on that task force as we take this forward. So we wanted to wrap up with restating part of one of Randy Hester's declaration from yesterday, because a lot of folks were clearly in the conversations were really influenced by Randy, and we wanted to, Diane's going to share his just beauty portion of his declaration.
Yeah, I'm reading this because Randy Hester actually was my professor at Berkeley. He is not a black woman, and I am not a white male, but he was my role model. He still is. And you know, he taught me that, you know, landscape architecture could be about beauty and also about changing communities and shaping people's lives. So, just beauty. The landscape can never be more beautiful than it is just. We vow to make the world both beautiful and just simultaneously. We claim environmental justice as our cause, knowing full well the difficulties therein. We commit to equitable access and distribution of landscape resources, their cost, benefits, and joys. We will create places that welcome all segments of society, not just the privileged few. We will provide open space equally in every neighborhood. We will locate necessary but undesirable land uses fairly, regardless of race or class. We will map injustices in our communities, set strategies, and find partners to overcome the injustices.
Thank you. Thank you.